really made progress with that. Yeah. Testing, testing, testing. Yeah. All right. Amazing. So this one is for you. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sculpting the Brain, Youth Development and Mental Health. My name is Olivia Kelly, and I'm a cultural producer here at the City of Sydney. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the City of Sydney conducts its work on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations attendees joining us today. So I just have a few little housekeeping things to go through first. So today's event is hybrid, so we have some people joining us via Zoom, and we will be recording through Zoom. The best way to view the talk if you're joining us on Zoom is to choose Fit to Window from the View Options drop-down at the top of your screen. This talk is being interpreted in Auslan today, and we thank our fantastic interpreters, Isabella and Samantha. We've created a short survey to find out about your experience today, so we'll also be putting up a QR code at the end of the talk, and we'll email you a survey link as well, so you can just let us know how you found today, if there's anything else you would like to see from the City of Sydney. We will also have some photography happening today. So we have our photographer, Ava, over here in the green dress. So if you don't want to be photographed, just let Ava know. We can work around that. Okay, so today we have two early career researchers from the Child Neurodevelopment and Mental Health team at the Brain and Mind Centre who are here to discuss early brain development and neurodevelopmental conditions. We have Dr. Shrujna Patel and Dr. Kelsie Boulton, who will share their innovative research they are conducting to support child neurodevelopment and help children and families. Okay, so now I'll hand over to Dr. Shrujna Patel.
Thanks, Olivia. Before I start, I'm just going to give a really brief introduction of neural networks, which is the craft activity that everyone's doing today. So we're joined by Pat Pillai and Rita Pierce, who are the founders of Neural Networks, which was started 10 years ago as a mindfulness project. They've since hosted many events like this, demonstrated knitting, crocheting, and the no-net methods to make these really cool neurons in a range of community groups. And like today, the opportunity to do the craft is paired with talks about neuroscience. Neural Networks is based on the principle that yarn craft, with its mental challenges, social connection, and mindfulness, helps brains stay fit by solving problems and using creative thinking. The gorgeous textile neurons created reflect what a neuron looks like when it's placed under a microscope. It's a complex structure with dendrites, axons, and synapses. The project has travelled the world, and right now there is an exhibition of the neurons at Francis Crick Institute in the UK. So please continue making your neurons during the talk, all part of the mindfulness process, and then we'll also have some time afterwards to ask Pat and Rita any questions. Neural Networks is supported by Inspiring New South Wales, which is a science engagement program that includes National Science Week. And we hope to see some of you here back in August for part of the National Science Week program. So today I'm going to talk to you about how the immune system is involved in sculpting the brain. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So the immune system has been in the media throughout the pandemic. Most of us know more about the immune system now than we ever did in the past. We're incredibly aware now that it's our body's defense against pathogens, viruses and bacteria that will cause infection and make us sick. If we do get sick, it's the immune system that helps our body fight back and make us feel better again. Beyond this role in traditional host defense, the immune system plays a really key role in brain development. I'm going to face this way because everyone's kind of sitting on this side. Brain development starts from the moment of conception, so that's before we're born, and continues all the way through into early adulthood. The majority of brain development happens while in gestation, in pregnancy, or in the first year of life. Microglia, which are the immune cells of the brain, play a really key role in this brain development process. So you can think of microglia as the vacuum cleaners or the guardians of the brain. It's their job to sense when something's not quite right. And they show up and essentially suction everything up, get rid of it and destroy it and put it away, keeping the brain nice and clean and keeping all our normal processes functioning. So this includes things like infections that have traveled to the brain, debris that's left behind as a part of normal brain function, cells that are dying, or proteins that are misshapen and clumped up that shouldn't be there anymore. As part of this vacuum cleaning process, the microglia are the key mediators of a process called synaptic pruning. So our brain is made up of millions and millions of neurons, which is, actually detailed really nicely in the neural networks handout. So neurons form structures by connecting with one another, and the connections where one neuron communicates with a second neuron is called a synapse. When many, many neurons get together, they form circuits. And these are the brain circuits that underlie all of our behavior, thoughts, feelings, actions. These brain circuits tell us what to do, how to do it. They keep our body functioning. They keep all of our systems running. These circuits need to be shaped and rewired and developed to support our brain and our growth as we pass through the first years of early childhood. And the microglia are kind of like the gardeners. They prune these circuits and they help us strengthen the connections that we use the most, and they get rid of connections that we don't use or we don't need. So they're really important in helping our brain develop mature brain circuits. I think the clicker is working. Thank you. So this slide actually shows microscopic images of neurons as they're developing. If you have a look in the newborn and 3-month images, you can see that the neurons are really immature and their processes, their dendrites and axons haven't developed very much, and they don't have very many connections between different cells. If you look by 6 months and 2 years of age, you can see that there's a huge amount of growth that has occurred, and the processes and circuits have become incredibly dense. And then by 4 years and 6 years, you can see the pattern has changed again, where the neurons are now much more mature, less dense, and you can see that there are circuits sort of in a uniform direction starting to form. So the microglia are the cells that do this. They underlie all of the processes that occur to make these circuits. The other thing to appreciate about this slide is the sheer amount of development that's happening so quickly when we're young. Every single part of this process, this forming of these circuits, has to be really, really well balanced. Too much pruning or too little pruning is going to result in abnormal brain development. So it's a very sensitive, vulnerable time during development. So what happens when this process is disrupted? It can result in what we call neurodevelopmental disorders. Some common ones that you may have heard of are autism, ADHD, tics and Tourette's syndrome, and obsessive compulsive disorder. So these are disorders of the developing brain where something somewhere along the way hasn't gone quite right in the process of our brain growing from pregnancy into early childhood. They affect 10% of all children collectively, which is not a small number, and it's really alarming that the numbers and the rates of diagnosis are actually rising every year, and they're rising really fast. So we have a lot of children, a lot of families that are struggling with neurodevelopmental disorders. They're characterized by impairments in social communication, cognitive deficits, intellectual disability, repetitive movements and behaviors, or restricted interests. It's also really common for these disorders to occur together. It's very rare that a child will present with only one disorder or only a very small range of symptoms. It's much more common that they will have multiple diagnoses, multiple disorders, and lots of different overlapping symptoms, making it even more challenging to treat them. They also commonly present with mental health symptoms like depression and anxiety, obviously, which can be very debilitating in a young child. They're caused by complex interactions between genetic risk factors, which we inherit from our parents and grandparents at the DNA level, and also by environmental risk factors, which include all the things that we're exposed to in our environment from pregnancy before we've been born. So that includes things our mothers have been exposed to while they're pregnant, and then also things, trauma, stress, infections, disease, environmental chemicals, pollutants, things like that, that we might be exposed to in early childhood as well. And as I said, that period of development is so sensitive that any of these combinations of things can result in abnormal brain development. So how do we help these children? Right now, we have sort of two approaches that we use to manage these disorders. We have psychological interventions, which include things like behavioral therapies, occupational and speech therapy, art therapy, music therapy, things like that. And also some limited medical intervention, which is actually focused on treating symptoms of the disorders as they present. So for example, if a child is really struggling with depressive symptoms and is already doing psychological intervention in therapy counseling to help manage that, we might add on antidepressants to just help that a little bit more. If a child is really struggling to focus in the classroom, we might put them on stimulants, which is an ADHD medication, to help them, focus and be attentive in the classroom. But these are very symptom-focused treatments, and they might work well for a lot of children. So if you have children who are doing well on these treatments and they can function well in their life otherwise with the help of these treatments, that's great and they do really well and that's wonderful. But sometimes these treatments will fail. And what happens to the children who don't respond to any of these treatments? So there are about 30% of children who will not respond to any of these conventional treatments. And they are so sick, they cannot get out of bed and go to school. They can't put clothes on and get dressed because they have debilitating sensory issues or they have very debilitating OCD. These are not children who have anxiety, which can be managed. These are children who are missing months of school. These are children who cannot function day to day in their life. They end up in hospital, and these are the children that our research at the Children's Hospital at Westmead primarily focuses on. Thank you. So why don't we have any, what we call in scientific terms, disease-modifying treatments? I'll just break that down. What that means is that we don't have any treatments that target the underlying biology of what is causing these disorders. We don't have anything that helps correct any of the underlying mechanisms, the processes. And the reason behind this is that we don't have any biomarkers to help us identify any of these disorders. So if a child with autism presents to a GP or to hospital because they're seriously unwell, they might be given a routine test of MRI, which is brain scanning, or they might be given some blood tests. Most of the time, these brain scans, these blood tests, all the routine tests we can offer them will come back normal. They will not show us anything that we can target, anything out of the ordinary that we can be like, that's what's wrong, that's what we can treat. So that's one of the biggest problems in this field. We don't have anything that will identify what is happening inside the brain. We don't have anything that we can be like, yep, that's what we're going to treat to help this child. And so that's what my team's research at the Children's Hospital is focusing on, helping us understand what is the underlying biology of these disorders. We call them disease mechanisms. And then how can we modify the disease mechanisms to treat what the underlying problem is, rather than just treating symptoms as and when they present. So to do this, we're using a combination of a few things. So we use a very comprehensive medical history. And part of our work at the hospital has been standardizing this data collection. So when children present, we want to collect information in a consistent way. We want to collect all of their family history, including pregnancy history, including history that affects the grandparents and close aunts and uncles. And then we combine this with detailed neurodevelopmental assessments. And that means that we're trying to measure how impaired they are, how serious their symptoms are in different domains: cognitive impairment, social impairment, functional impairment, how incapacitated are they in their daily lives. And then we combine this with molecular sequencing of blood, which is using high throughput sequencing technologies that go beyond the routine blood tests that you might order at pathology. So they're sent off to specialized research labs and then analyzed by bioinformaticians to help us develop a comprehensive picture of their clinical background, their medical background, their current neurodevelopmental picture, their presentation. What do they look like? How are they impaired? What is the priority in helping them get back into school, get back into their daily lives? And then what does that look like on a biological level in their blood? What does the signature look like? So the questions we're trying to answer using this approach is, what is the difference between children who have neurodevelopmental disorders and those who don't? Is there a biological profile that we can measure? Can we see this in their blood? Are there biomarkers that we can target with treatments? What kind of medications would they respond to? And who is most likely to respond? So another really important point to note here is that every child is different, every brain is different, and no two children with autism present in the same way. They don't look the same, they don't have the same symptoms, they don't have the same biological profile. But can we see patterns? Can we see patterns of underlying biology that is helping us sort of figure out on a higher level, on a pathway level, what we could potentially target with treatment? And then from there, we can try to individually focus down using precision medicine, personalized approaches to try and help individual children. But that sort of comes later down the line. Right now, we're even struggling to characterize on a biological level what they look like. And so that's what we've been focusing on, to help us try and pull apart these complex interactions between genetic risk, environmental risk, what's going on in the family. Has there been stress, trauma in early childhood that could potentially exacerbate certain symptoms? And then have conventional therapies, psychological interventions been trialed? Has any of that been useful? If it is, of course, we continue that. And if not, what else can we do outside of the conventional box to help these children? And so I just want to leave you with this final thought before I hand over. Brain development is active and dynamic. This research is really exciting, and it makes me excited because we have an opportunity to intervene. Brains are developing, they're changing so fast. And by taking a more active approach, a more proactive approach in intervention, we can really change the entire trajectory of these children's lives. We can completely set them up on a different pathway long term to help them thrive in society. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kelsie, and we're just going to switch seats as well so she can see the slides.
I might actually stand up if that's all right, Olivia. So it's all good. All good? Yeah, all good. Just get amongst it. So thank you. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I can sit if that's easier. That's okay. I'll sit. That's fine. It's all good. Thank you so much, Shrujna, and really fantastic to hear about the work you're doing. And I think a real testament to the work we're doing at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney that we have so much fantastic research. Can I get you to? Oh, yeah. Thanks. Excellent. There we go. So hi, everyone. I'm Kelsie Boulton. I'm a research fellow in the Child Neurodevelopment and Mental Health team at the University of Sydney. And today I wanted to share with you some of the work our team's been conducting around supporting child neurodevelopment and mental health needs, and particularly how we've, as researchers, partnered with clinical services to really drive research translation, improve outcomes for children and families. It's the red one. Great. Excellent. So I just wanted to provide a very brief overview just of what I'll be covering today. So I'll talk a little bit about child neurodevelopment in the Australian landscape, which Shrujna has spoken about very eloquently. And then I'll talk about how we've really leveraged relationships with clinical services to create partnerships that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So we've embedded research within clinical services, engaged with our clinical partners to identify the needs of families and to understand how we can support children and families with neurodevelopmental conditions. I'll discuss how we developed and embedded a digital platform and really a digital ecosystem within clinical services to uplift the capacity of services to provide assessments and also to understand the needs of these 1 in 10 children and families within the community. And then I'll share some of the outcomes from this platform that we have to date. Oh, well, there we are. Excellent. So before I dive in, I just wanted to sort of step back a bit and provide you with a vision of where we see this research program now and in our vision for the future. So we have 4 key goals. The first is for children with neurodevelopmental conditions who are presenting to clinical services for an assessment. We know that we need to make those assessments much swifter. We need to decrease wait times, and we need to make sure children and families are supported from the earliest point possible in their healthcare journey. Secondly, we know that we need to address broad needs. We know, as Shrujna described, children with autism don't just have autism. There can be mental health concerns. There can be other developmental concerns. And it's important that we address all of those needs to provide the best possible outcome for the child and their family. We know that health is becoming more digital. Mental health has provided a wonderful example of the benefits of digital tools. And one of the goals of our research program is to use digital tools to uplift the capacity of clinical services to support children and families and to make sure they're supported across time and that the supports they receive are updated as their needs change. So it's measurement-based care. And lastly, our goal is to build the evidence base in this space, to know that we are conducting gold standard evidence-based research that is improving outcomes of children and families. Excellent. So to provide a brief overview, as we've discussed, we know that 1 in 10 children has a neurodevelopmental condition, so 10% of all children. And up to 85% of children can have more than one condition, and this can be physical conditions, other developmental conditions, mental health conditions. And from an economic perspective, the cost is enormous. So neurodevelopmental conditions and related conditions, including mental health, are estimated to cost up to $50 billion. And we see this reflected, this cost reflected in the rising rates of neurodevelopmental conditions. So this data on the left is American, but essentially we see the same trends in Australia. The rates of autism are increasing dramatically. And what we see with our disability scheme in Australia, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, is that the most common source of funding the NDIS is used for children and young people is developmental delay and autism. So it suggests that there is a really huge need to support these children and families better and more quickly from the point that concerns are first identified. And this is partnered with what we see in clinical services, which is a really long wait time to receive assessments. So we know that particularly for public health services, families can be waiting 2 years for an assessment. And what that means is that there's often an enormous delay in a really critical point of development. So what we've done as a research team is identify, we sort of asked, how can we make meaningful change to children and families? And we've integrated our research with clinical services to create what we've coined the living laboratory. So we partner with clinical services across New South Wales to identify needs in children and families presenting to these services within the community. So I wanted to provide a little bit snapshot of what we've done with these partnerships to date. So we've established a research registry, which is the largest of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. And we have over 2,300 children in this research registry. And what we found is that this is a community-based registry. So we're collecting information on families who aren't typically represented in the research literature. So half of the families coming through these clinical services are culturally and linguistically diverse. There's a large proportion of vulnerable families. There's quite a large proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families coming through these services. And we know that these families are likely to be in need and not get the services they need quickly and efficiently. And it's very important that we can advocate for the needs of these families that are often unaddressed. And this is just to demonstrate what we hear anecdotally from clinicians and what we talk about a lot, that children, and this is data from our registry, children with autism don't just present with autism. So while the majority of children entering the Child Development Registry app did have a diagnosis of autism, 71%, over half of them had another neurodevelopmental condition, and over half of them also had significantly elevated mental health needs. So it suggests that these conditions don't exist in a silo, and treating them as such isn't effective. We need to make sure the broad needs of the child and family are addressed from the earliest point in time and supported over time. So I wanted to share now outcomes of the work we've done with clinical services. So when we started integrating research with clinical services, we sat down and said, what is the journey a patient goes through when they attend your service, from the point of entering the wait list, if you like, to when they present for assessment, and what needs do they have access to and where are the barriers, and then what do they take away from that assessment to continue on with their healthcare journey. And once we'd identified these 4 steps, we built research projects around these steps. And the goal of these projects was to understand the needs of children attending these services, but also understand how we could apply them to children and families in the community more broadly to address needs and work on improving, conducting research to improve outcomes more widely. So first of all, I'll talk about what we did when we spoke about before families attend assessment. So the very first thing we did was develop a digital platform. So essentially families could complete assessments online at home, and so there was increased speed and efficiency of assessments being conducted. And from a research perspective, we could have that information available to report on and advocate for. So the first piece of research that we produced, which Shrujna and I worked on together, was looking at whether this was an effective way of assessment for families. We knew if we were going to ask children and families living in the community to complete information online electronically, it had to be something that would be done that was acceptable, that was easy, that was accessible. And we found that overwhelmingly it was. So as you can see, the vast majority of our families preferred to complete assessments where possible online before they came into assessments. And then what we found was that increased the efficiency of the clinical process. So clinicians had more time with the families on the day because they had all of that valuable information completed beforehand. So it was a proof of concept for further building out this digital platform. And what this initial study also demonstrated was evidence for the assessment delays that are reported in the media, that are reported anecdotally. So we had solid research evidence to show that on average, less than half of children received a developmental assessment by 5 years. And this was in over 900 children attending a Sydney-based developmental assessment service at the Children's Hospital at Westmead. Thank you. We also found that the assessment delays were contrasted with when parents identified concerns. So on average, parents identify concerns in their children very early, about 3 years of average, and then 3 years of age on average. And then there was this delay to getting these assessments. So we started thinking about what supports, and we are thinking about what supports can we build in at a community level for families. So can we upskill, not upskill, but increase health literacy in parents. So when they do identify a problem, how can they have, particularly in culturally and linguistically diverse parents, how can they have the language, and how can we support them to have the language to approach their GP or their paediatrician and ensure those concerns are identified and lead to a referral if need be. Yep, and on the other end of that, we also have been doing in the clinic, looking at how we can automate some of these assessments. So we've worked with engineers and we have video recordings of autism assessments, and we've identified that we can determine autism versus neurotypical control based on body movements and child caregiver interaction at a high level. So we're working on expanding this out in clinical services and in the community. It's been done in the research lab so far, and this provides another valuable way of how we can use technology to identify potential delays or potential flags for a developmental concern more swiftly and ensure those children receive the appropriate support in a more streamlined manner. All right. So the second question that we ask with clinicians is, when children present for an assessment, what needs do they present with? And we're thinking about those broader needs that extend beyond the referral concern for autism or intellectual disability. So we looked at mental health because we know that's a very common need. And what we found when we conducted a mental health screening questionnaire on, this was on over 200 children coming through the service, was that mental health needs were highly elevated in this population. So over half of the children had mental health needs in the clinically elevated level. And when children had 2 or more diagnoses, that rate increased to over 70%. So we started thinking, these children are attending the service for a developmental assessment and they're not necessarily receiving support for those mental health needs. What can we do to build in some support or some resources? So what we've started doing now, and this slide's a little bit busy, but essentially what we've done is we've conducted a review of all of the available digital e-tools and apps on your phone for child development and mental health, with the idea that once we review these apps for their evidence-based, their reliability, their usability, their functionality, we can identify which ones are performing best and recommend them to families where needs are identified. So it provides an additional resource for families when they need it, and allows them to be linked in with support and resources earlier on in their healthcare journey. Oopsie daisy. So the next question we asked with the clinicians was, what supports do families have when they attend services and what barriers do they experience? And what we found was very interesting. So we found that within this service, so I should preface this by saying it is a service in the Children's Hospital Westmead, so it's a tertiary service, so children do require paediatrician referral. Unsurprisingly, given that most children had access to a GP or a paediatrician. However, as you can see in the top graph, very way on the right, very few families had access to behavioural management and skills therapies. So behavioural supports are one of the sort of most commonly and evidence-based supports for autism. And very few families also had access to psychology. Then when we asked families, what services do you want but can't access, the most common services reported were behavioural supports and skills programs and psychology. So it suggests that there's a large, we're able to show with evidence that there's a large discrepancy between what families want access to and what they currently have access to. So we can start thinking about how we can increase access to those supports that are wanted. We also looked at the main barriers that inhibited families from receiving these supports. And unsurprisingly, long wait lists were a big one. That's common across the sector in general, and mental health. We're not saying anything unique there. And also financial barriers were very big there. And then something that we found really interesting was we asked caregivers, what interventions have you accessed that are specific to caregivers? So these are things like parenting support programs or respite. And we found that very few caregivers had accessed those supports that were focused on them. But when we said, would you access this if you could? As you can see from this graph on the right, nearly half of caregivers said, yes, I would like to access a parenting support program. So again, it shows a discrepancy between what caregivers want and what they're receiving, and provides us with an opportunity to start thinking about how we can increase access to those services and awareness of those services. So the last step of the sort of patient journey that was identified with our services was post-assessment. So what do families receive when they finish the assessment that they go off with and continue on their journey? And in the context of the services we've partnered with to date, this was in the form of a diagnostic report. So we conducted a review of 85 reports. And what we found, what we looked at was, what was the caregiver referral concern stated in the report? So the caregiver was concerned about X, and what was the clinician referral concern? And as you can see, so these are the top 5 concerns from the caregivers on the left and the clinicians on the right, and the top 5 are equivalent. But what we found interesting was that in general, most clinicians, so 65%, rated autism as a referral concern, which makes sense. They're referring for an assessment to make a diagnosis of autism. However, when we looked at the most commonly reported parent concerns, they were in more general domains, so social skills and play, behavioural challenges, speech and language. Autism was still there, but it was these broad needs that affect daily functioning and performing at school and quality of life that parents were stating as concerns. So again, it identified a little bit of a discrepancy between the types of referral concerns, and suggested that we can start thinking about how we can address some of those parental concerns within the report. We also reviewed the reports in terms of their recommendations provided and their readability as well. So what we found here was that, well, a lot of children, 60% of children, had clinically elevated internalizing symptoms. Only 27% of reports for those 60% of children had information relating to those mental health needs. And then concurrently, we found that only 13% of the reports had information on comorbid conditions, despite being present in much more than 13% of children. So again, it highlighted ways that the reports could be potentially adjusted or have those broader needs addressed in addition to the specific diagnosis of autism. And I should say this was 85 reports for children who had received a diagnosis of autism. So it absolutely makes sense that there was diagnostic specificity there. And then the last thing we looked at was the readability of the reports. And we know that these reports serve many, many purposes. One very important one, which is often receiving NDIS funding. So it makes sense that they do need to contain a lot of detail for medical professionals, for education specialists, for the NDIS services. But what we found was that the readability level of the reports was quite high. It was above the national recommended level, and keeping in mind that half of these families are culturally and linguistically diverse. Something that the service actually said was, wow, maybe we should look at having a summary page on the front that's a little bit more accessible for parents, while still keeping that very important detail that is required for the many purposes of the reports. So we're working with clinical services, and we're also working with software engineers to look at how we can automate some process of some parts of the reports. How can we automate some of the scoring and integration so that clinicians can focus on tailoring the information to the family and making sure the family needs are presented in an accessible way. So I wanted to now before I wrap up, just bring back what I mentioned at the start. So the goal of this research is to create streamlined pathways of care. So through what we have done to date and what we continue to do, we want to decrease the wait time for assessments, address broad needs in children and families so that we're not just addressing needs that are specific to a single diagnosis, develop and roll out digital tools that can support those broad needs and that support needs as they change over time. And finally, building an evidence base that we can use to develop, promote and implement supports to improve outcomes for children and families. So I'd like to thank the Child Neurodevelopment and Mental Health team at BMC, the Clinic for Autism and Neurodevelopment Research at BMC, and our amazing clinical partners at the Sydney Children's Hospital Network, particularly the Kids Hospital at Westmead and the Child Development Unit. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we do now have a Q&A portion where you're welcome to, we open the floor to any questions you may have for our speakers today. And we'll also be taking questions online, which you can submit via the Q&A icon or the chat function. Okay, so do we have any questions from the room? Yep, we've got a question here. All right. I will give this mic for you guys to share and I'll pass this one around the room. So just if everyone could just speak into the mic so everyone online can hear you.
Sure, thank you. Look, two related questions. One, everyone must be concerned about the recorded increase in autism in children. And the question I have in relation to that, is that just a result of better research we've done, or is that a societal problem we've got to deal with? That's the first question. So the increase in autism, which is pretty significant from the graph you've shown us. The second related question seems to me is, have you done any research on populations? As an example of what I mean, I'm not trying to be in any way racist, but anecdotally, for example, in Japan, OCD seems to be, is only my anecdotal experience, a much more significant problem than, say, in Australia. So have we done any broader research around the world, you've talked about American data, as to the prevalence of certain of these neurodevelopmental disorders?
Did you want to start? Thank you. So to answer your first question about the increasing prevalence, I think that there's a range of reasons for that. However, what we do know is that we are much better at detecting and identifying signs of autism now than we were even 10 or 15 years ago. So while the rates of autism are increasing, what we do find is that the rate of the incidence of individuals with autism and co-occurring intellectual disability, so what initially might have been seen as more severe autism, that rate hasn't really changed. So it doesn't suggest that the rates are being artificially inflated at all, just that we're much better at identifying and detecting autism earlier on. And in relation to the second question around population studies, I think that's very interesting. I'm not sure of any data from Japan off the top of my head. I know worldwide the prevalence of 1 in 10 children with a neurodevelopmental condition it does seem to be represented across global data sets, across population level data sets. I'm not 100% sure on the rates of OCD, actually, but I think we have more power as researchers in the conclusions we make and the implications we draw when we do have larger samples that represent a larger cross-section of society than one country.
I'm just going to add to the first question that you asked. So yes, we are better at diagnosing and detecting autism, and that is definitely, it contributes to the increase in the rates, but also our environment is changing really quickly and has been for the last, few decades. So there are lots of different things in the environment that increase the risk of disturbing brain development, like I was talking about. And a lot of those actually happen during pregnancy. And just as a couple of examples, things like obesity, autoimmune diseases, inflammatory diseases during pregnancy, stress, mental health conditions, basically anything that activates your immune system, inflames you, makes you really stressed, whether it's a psychological or a physical condition, increases the risk of the child developing neurodevelopmental disorders. So if you actually look at the graphs that show the rise of neurodevelopmental disorders going like this, there's a similar rise in the rates of autoimmune disease and obesity. So changing of our environmental risk during pregnancy and in early childhood is also likely contributing to this increased risk.
Okay, fantastic. Do we have any other questions from in the room? Yeah.
Mine isn't really a question, but it's to help answer that last question. There's research from Scandinavia, from South Africa, from the Middle East, where they've looked at the incidence of autism spectrum disorder over the last 20 years. And there's a definite increase. It's not just in diagnosis, but in all of those countries. And certainly the incidence is different in varying countries, but there is a rise everywhere, and nowhere do they think that it's just because of diagnosis.
Okay, do we have any, we do have some questions from online. I'll just come and read them out. Okay, we have a few actually. I may actually just bring this over as well for you to read them, because some of them are on the longer side. Oop. Sorry, one moment. Okay.
So the first one is, do you know if the increased rates of diagnosis in ADHD autism are attributed to better awareness or diagnostic tools? Or does the research indicate there is an increase in factors impacting child brain development?
So I think we've partly answered that already. And yes, there is generally an improved awareness, improved diagnostic criteria for both autism and ADHD. But as we said, there is also a genuine increase in diagnosis. And part of that's attributed to changing environment, and part of it's still unknown, but it is increasing.
Another one here. Are there preventative strategies and techniques for parents to support their children early on when they notice mental health needs? For example, very low resilience and anxiety have not addressed that may become more significant impairments later on.
Look, I don't have a psychology background, so I'm not going to comment too much on this. Of course, there are things that parents can do to support children in their early development, especially if problems are identified. But as Kelsie described, a lot of the problem is in identifying and arming parents with the skills to help the children. Coping mechanisms for anxiety, like mindfulness, routines, those kinds of things are certainly beneficial and can help manage day-to-day functioning in the long run. But they're not, I wouldn't go so far as to call them preventative measures for neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yeah, really well said, Shrujna. I think probably I'd add to that as well that at least what our data has shown from the developmental delay side is that parents know when something is off, and that gut instinct as a parent should be listened to. And so I think something that we have a duty to do as researchers is to make sure parents are armed with the health literacy and the understanding of how to ensure or talk to their health professionals to ensure those concerns are heard and they can receive the support they need for their child as early as possible.
Okay, we have another question from the room. I'm very impressed with the progress you're all making with the knitting.
Thank you. My question was just, are there any general recommendations that you're putting together or looking at for parents before they actually decide to try to have children to help with that development during pregnancy and pre-pregnancy?
It's a really, really loaded question. So on the genetic risk side of things, if there are known genetic disorders within a family that parents are aware of, they sort of can be taken down a genetic counseling line. These are serious genetic risk factors that are identified in the parents, and they may have already been in pre-pregnancy talks with genetic counselors to identify whether, to coach them on their decision-making processes around having a family. In terms of, but also I'm going to say that only accounts for a very, very small proportion of children with neurodevelopmental disorders. Most of these, over 90%, are caused by complex interaction between genetic risk and the environment. And so it's really difficult for us to be able to look at a person and then counsel them on whether or not they should be having children, obviously. And then there's another really complicated communication education piece around this, is that a lot of things that we're talking about are referring to maternal risk during pregnancy. And we already have a lot of things, a lot of women already bear a lot of pressure or a lot of guilt around, is my child unwell because I didn't do this or because I did this during pregnancy? And that obviously is very damaging. And we can't say with certainty whether certain risk factors, because you have them, you are definitely going to have a child with neurodevelopmental disorder or not. So it's about, we're working towards this, but it's really difficult, sensitive area to navigate. There are things that we can do in the preconception space that focus generally on well-being. So promoting well-being during in adulthood before you're thinking about having babies. So that's obviously holistic, and that's about exercising well, eating well, low stress, trying to deal with the things that you can deal with before you think about having kids. But again, a lot of families that are in this situation don't have the means, the education, the money to do a lot of those things. It is expensive to eat healthy and exercise well and not be stressed. It's hard. So it's really challenging area. Do you want to add any?
Do we have more? Yeah, a question from the room.
I've got a question for Kelsie here. Congratulations on the data. It's fantastic. Digital assessment is going to definitely be effective broadly. My question is more around digital therapeutics and the challenge of compliance, particularly with adolescents. Well, with humans in general, I think people struggle to comply. So I just wondered if you could give us a comment on the barriers or the challenges that may be in digital therapeutics, psychological or parenting or whatever it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good question and so pertinent now. I know maybe 5-6 years ago, apps for mental health were all the rage, and it's going to change the game. And I think the compliance rate was 0.1%. Very, very low. And there's a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons for that. One being that it's very easy to get enthusiastic about something that's going to help you with very little effort, or very little engagement. It's very easy to ignore notifications or not do that, and life gets in the way. So I think where we are is in a place, and the other thing I should say with a lot of digital therapeutics is the regulations are non-existent. So we know that the research to clinic pathway, or the research to clinical practice time lag, is 17 years. So it takes 17 years from a research finding to be implemented in clinical practice on average, if it ever is. App developers, digital therapeutics, are not waiting for that. They're developing apps, optimizing them, and there's no evidence base for them. We found when we reviewed 112 digital tools and apps that 2 had an evidence base. So it's really poor, but it does speak to the fact that I think we need to be more adaptive and agile as researchers in what we consider as gold standard evidence. Do we need a 4-phase RCT on 5,000 people to provide efficacy and evidence for something? Or is there somewhere we can meet in the middle and leverage partnerships with technology, partnerships with services, and partnerships with research to identify some of these barriers towards compliance and uptake with apps, and also make sure the evidence base is better? So I think that's a long way of saying that, no, we don't have an answer to those issues, but being aware that they're there and understanding why they're there, and really co-designing these digital therapeutics and these digital solutions with the people that are going to use them. I don't think that's been done a lot. So having that co-design there, having the people who are using them in the room to inform on that in an iterative way, and going through that process, I think could make a difference, but I think it's something we'll be grappling with for a time to come.
Okay. We do have some more questions from online. So I'll just take a look.
Do you think we will see a shift in what supports are funded? For example, behavioral supports and psychological services through the NDIS with the new national autism strategy?
I think that could be potentially a little bit of a loaded question. So it's difficult to know at the moment what will be funded and what won't be. I think what's really important is that we ensure that the needs of the community are heard and that the needs of the community are advocated for in a way that the people making these decisions in government will listen and take note of.
I'm going to combine these two questions. I'm not sure if these have been answered in some form, but they relate to can neurodevelopmental delay diagnosis be missed during childhood and detected later in life, e.g. higher risk of dementia later in life? And how many, if yes, how many are there to have found to have that diagnosis as an adult when it wasn't diagnosed as a child?
Sorry, just to clarify, was that diagnosis of dementia later in life?
For example.
For example, okay. So of course, it's very possible for a diagnosis to be missed in childhood. In the rates of diagnosis are increasing now, but actually people who are adults now, so our age, so many of them are now going and getting diagnoses for neurodevelopmental conditions that weren't diagnosed when they were younger. I'm just going to point out that dementia is a neurodegenerative condition, which is not neurodevelopmental, so it doesn't begin when you're in childhood. So there are definitely risks and studies showing relationships between neurodevelopmental disorders and diagnosis of neurodegenerative conditions later in life, but it's not one doesn't necessarily lead to the other.
Okay, do we have any more questions from the room? Nope. Well, good. Well, that is perfect timing, actually. So yes, thank you all for joining us for the talk today. And thank you so much for your talk. It was very insightful, and it's always amazing to hear about the research that's going on at the Brain and Mind Centre. So we will be sticking around for another half hour. If you'd like to stick around to knit neurons or continue to knit neurons, we'll have our experts here today sticking around if you'd like to chat or have any questions, or if you just want to hang out. We'll be wrapping up at 5:30. Okay, so thank you all for coming today, and we'll see you next time.